together in their nation's capital, in front of Parliament, to engage in dialogue with their elected officials. Protesting is, in fact, the people trying to have a dialogue with their government as a last resort of engagement when all other avenues for discourse have failed or have been censored. A healthy democracy demands continuous engagement between people and government. And when the government uses violence to assert its power over the people, the fabric of democracy is torn. That is what was witnessed at the protest. We heard from witness and protester Maggie Byrne, who knelt before the public order units, placed a copy of the Canadian Bill of Rights, the first human rights law in Canada, onto the snow in front of her before being brutally snatched and shoved behind the police lines, thrown to the frozen ground, beaten, and had a rifle pointed to her head. We heard from witness and veteran Chris Deering, survivor of a bomb explosion in Afghanistan. He fought for our country because he believed that our Canadian values were worth fighting for. He said he came to Ottawa because it was his duty to support the protesters in their cry to the Canadian government that enough is enough. They've gone too far with interfering with our right to freedom, our right to live in a safe country, free from fear. In response to our dear veterans' bravery, moral courage, and sacrifice for this country, he was brutally beaten by the police and treated with less human dignity than a prisoner of war. The fact is, it does not matter which side of the protest you are on. To be Canadian is to value human dignity, kindness, community, compassion, and love. It is not normal to hate and divide. This public inquiry is more than just looking into circumstances that led to the government's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. It is the beginning of a journey of rediscovering of what it means to be Canadian. The government does not define us, we do. We, the collective of many diverse groups across the country. The protest in Ottawa brought so many Canadians from all different walks of life together. It was an opportunity for reconciliation, for uniting and forging friendships despite so many differences. The protest in Ottawa gave people hope, and it humbled all of us. What we saw in Ottawa is emblematic of what it means to be Canadian, and that is what terrifies the current government of Canada. Yes, there was honking and diesel and noise, and that was not only challenging for residents in Ottawa, but also for protesters. But the protesters were not extremists or terrorists. They are fellow Canadians, neighbors, and each person is the thread that holds us together in a peaceful and loving society. We have all suffered in our own unique way because of the pandemic, the virus, the sickness, the lockdowns, the job losses, loss of livelihood, the mandates, and mental health. On the first day of this public order emergency inquiry, Commissioner Rouleau, you said uncovering the truth is an important goal. When difficult events occurred that impact the lives of Canadians, the public has the right to know what happened. C'est l'objectif de l'enquête publique.
So the goal of this public inquiry is to shed a light on the situation which occurred and to make recommendations so that this situation will not occur again.
Let this inquiry be the starting point for all Canadians. And that means all Canadians, including government leaders, to hold the executive branch of Canada to account. If there ever was a time for a Prime Minister to step down, now is that time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next is the Ottawa Coalition, please.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Paul Champ for the Ottawa Coalition of Residents and Businesses. I'm just going to try to focus, if I can, Commissioner, on the key points of evidence that I think are questions that you're going to have to try to determine in all the testimony and exhibits you've received over the last several weeks. First of all, what we know is that the Ottawa Police made a major mistake by allowing hundreds of semi-trucks to drive and park in downtown on the first weekend. The OPP disavowed supporting this idea and said that they thought the plan was to stop the trucks, but the reality is they also assisted in guiding the trucks downtown. So what happened there? Also, the Ottawa Police made a mistake in believing that they were only going to stay for a weekend. Despite all the other intelligence available, you heard a lot of evidence about how and why that decision was made or that calculation was made when there was a great deal of intelligence that suggested otherwise. But most significantly, Commissioner, by Monday, January 31st, the Ottawa Police already realized on that day that they had made these major mistakes, and they acknowledged internally that they were overwhelmed, did not have the capacity or the resources to police or manage these protests. They knew that. They were already calling it an occupation on Monday, January 31st. And from that day forward, they were trying to get help from other levels of government and from other police services. Now, what was going on after that? Well, we know that the Ottawa Police refrained from enforcement in most cases because of officer safety, including bylaw officer safety. And if the officers aren't safe, how can citizens and residents feel safe? They cannot, and they were not. Reports to police were not being followed up on, despite people calling repeatedly. You, of course, heard the circumstances, the context of downtown Ottawa, not only the dangerously loud horns that were going on all day and into the night, the blockaded streets that were obstructing traffic, public transit, and even emergency vehicles, the diesel fumes of hundreds of congregated and continuously idling semi-trucks, the street harassment, the threats to public officials at all levels, our mayor, our chief, our health officer, our federal politicians. Businesses were shut down with loss of profits and wages of $10 million per day. There were open fires in our streets on almost every corner in this downtown stamp, with gasoline and propane and fireworks going off beside them. On some days, our 911 lines were being jammed deliberately, and our hospitals were getting bomb threats. The situation was one of lawlessness in Ottawa. And that situation prevailed for a long time, and the people and residents and businesses of Ottawa felt abandoned. Using the words of the Police Services Act, the Ottawa Police could not provide adequate and effective policing out of the gate. They were just barely maintaining a baseline level of policing. And once it reached that point, and it really was very early, what happened? How did different levels of government respond? First and foremost, resources were delayed. The RCMP and the OPP were on the ground in small numbers early, but they withheld larger numbers because they were dissatisfied with the OPS plan. So you'll hear a lot of evidence about why those delays were happening and what happened. So you'll have to, I think, make some decisions about that or factual findings. And what did others know about that dysfunction? Other levels of government, and what did they do about it? Whether it's city officials, provincial, federal, and who was the responsible authorities who could do something about that situation? Was it the OPP? Was it the Ottawa Police Services Board? Was it Provincial Solicitor General? And then the other piece of evidence that we heard is that caused the delay is that once the Windsor blockade happened, it was clear then that Ottawa dropped in priority because the OPP simply did not have the resources to deal with both of those major events at once. Windsor was the priority. Until that situation was addressed, Ottawa would be left to wait. The final piece on evidence or questions you might that you're asked to determine or decide is how was it possible for the convoy organizers to bring it together? How did they organize and come to our city and occupy it? Because they did. I mean, the definition of an occupation is when an invading force enters into an area and takes control over that area, which is what they did in downtown Ottawa. It was organic, I think we heard. We heard there were people attracted for a variety of different reasons, but some of the leaders who we heard testified, I think were animated by a variety of different issues of misinformation. Some of them absolutely took some pleasure in what was happening with the people of Ottawa, that it was funny that people were unable to sleep. We heard evidence like that. And also that they felt justified in inflicting that harm on the people in downtown Ottawa because they had suffered. And I think we've heard that in spades. There's no question that the people, when the convoy of protesters, they had all been experiencing all kinds of hardships and stresses for 2 years. So that's the last issue I think you're going to have to decide, Commissioner. Just to conclude, you know, these convoy protests stretched our Constitution in every way. Our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and our cherished right to protest, was it stretched too far? I think clearly it was. But, you know, the fact that our authorities showed so much tolerance for so long in the residents, I think speaks a lot about our country. But our Constitution, also federalism, was stretched right out of shape. I think you're going to grapple with the evidence and the different levels of government, how they are interacting, and why it wasn't more seamless, which is what we would have hoped. So just to conclude, Commissioners, thank you very much. You know, I think this inquiry has demonstrated really the strength of our democracy, not only the fact that this inquiry is happening, but the way it was conducted. It was unprecedented, I think, in terms of the transparent we've seen of all levels of government. And no doubt, you know, what happened, whatever you find, I know that people are going to debate it anyway, and they've had the opportunity to do so, right? They've seen it.
Fair, that's a fair statement.
and no doubt study it for years to come about how government and police operate. It was quite amazing. And I have to say also the fact that the convoy organizing the protesters, they applied for leave to participate, and they have participated, I would believe, you know, in good faith. And I think it shows that, you know, that they had enough trust in our public institutions to do that. Still says a lot about the strength of Canada. So with that, Commissioner, I just want to thank you for the prodigious hard work that you've demonstrated and your commission team. It was, I think, an inspiration for all council here, and chapeau. Merci.
Thank you. Next is the Criminal Lawyers Association.
The Criminal Lawyers Association and Canadian Council of Criminal Defense Lawyers appreciate the opportunity to have participated in this commission. As criminal lawyers, we frequently scrutinize and challenge the exercise of power by government or law enforcement against individuals. We frequently defend guaranteed charter rights of people within Canada as against the reach and sometimes overreach of state authority. Challenges to whether an arrest was lawful, whether a search warrant was lawful, or whether a wiretap was lawful are commonly conducted before the courts. And it might be of interest to people who follow this commission and those who are not lawyers to know that it's not uncommon for there to be disagreement about the interpretation of laws, whether legal tests have been satisfied by evidence, or whether laws or actions of government actors were constitutional. In that way, it might be useful for people to understand that some of the disagreements that were revealed through these proceedings are not uncommon at all. The disclosure of thousands of documents and close forensic analysis of those documents reveals that protests were unquestionably challenging and demanded attention. It's not surprising that there were disagreements with respect to how to deal with the protests or occupations. It's not surprising that there was occasionally colorful and perhaps intemperate language revealed within some of the written communications. It's not surprising that various ideas were raised for consideration. That's the nature of a human process. the determination about whether to invoke an act such as this is inescapably a human process. The commission evidence reveals what many lawyers already know, which is how a particular law is to be interpreted and whether a particular legal test has been satisfied is often not straightforward. Uncertainty or disagreement about the interpretation of law is common. This might be unfortunate because the rule of law and constraint on the exercise of government power is best achieved when the meaning and the scope of law is certain. However, the history of law shows that that is very difficult to achieve. Therefore, what is important is that there be an impartial process for determining what the law means and whether the law has been complied with. This commission and the commission evidence has revealed the uncertainties surrounding the interpretation of the Emergencies Act. A central question is whether the test within the Emergencies Act, the important test, the extraordinary powers only be used as a matter of last resort, was satisfied on the facts as presented themselves. Whether that test was satisfied or not, the commission evidence revealed that an unquestionably challenging circumstance was responded to with focused consideration from law enforcement, elected, and unelected officials. There will be disagreement with respect to how that was done and whether it was done properly. But I think that people should be satisfied that it was done with care and with a serious deliberation. This commission will need to decide whether the invocation of the act was appropriate. We look forward to submitting our written submissions to assist the commission in making this determination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to call on the Union of British Columbia Indian Chiefs, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Cheyenne Arnold Cunningham. I'm counsel on behalf of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. The Union of BC Indian Chiefs has a significant interest in the exercise of emergency powers by the Canadian government generally. In this inquiry, we've been particularly interested in understanding how emergency powers were used in the Freedom Convoy situation and whether the use of state emergency powers respects Indigenous rights and jurisdiction. Solely on the facts, Commissioner, we have just one brief factual submission. We highlight from the evidence that there was limited, if any, consultation and engagement with local First Nations governments of the territory. On this, I draw your attention to the testimony of two witnesses who had close knowledge of this matter. First, we heard from Deputy Minister of Public Safety, Rob Stewart. In response to a question from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs regarding which First Nations governments, representatives, and Indigenous groups were consulted with during the convoy situation broadly, he testified that he was not aware of any consultation efforts, and he narrowly connected it to matters associated with law enforcement in urban areas or at border points. He also testified that he was not aware of any efforts on behalf of the Government of Canada or police services to consult with First Nations of the territory. However, it was later noted by Counsel for Canada that Canada did engage with Indigenous leaders specifically regarding blockades. But none were First Nations leaders of the territory where the events occurred. This is factually significant to us. This was further confirmed in the evidence of RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki. In response to questions from the Union of BC Indian Chiefs about whether First Nations of the territory were consulted, she testified that she was not sure. She noted it definitely did not occur in the Ottawa area, but there may have been efforts to do so in British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. But overall, she was not sure. Commissioner Lucki's evidence seems to suggest that, generally speaking, engagement with Indigenous peoples in these contexts occurs when there is Indigenous involvement or if the event was on Indigenous land, but noted that there's special teams that exist for that purpose. The Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendicino, confirmed that it is important for Public Safety Canada and police services to engage with First Nations of the territory, and that it's also important for this to be built into the response to public order emergency events across the government broadly. Minister Mendicino also emphasized that this type of engagement requires relationships to be built with Indigenous leaders so that we can move forward with reforms inspired and governed by the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Commissioner, the evidence in this inquiry illustrates that there was a lack of recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction in a public order emergency event, and a lack of respect for Indigenous rights, specifically including the obligation to engage properly with the First Nations governing body that is a representative of the traditional territory or territories where a public order event occurs. This is noteworthy and important, as the coordination of jurisdiction and authority must include First Nations governments and representative leaders from the territories impacted. We thank you for the opportunity to be part of this inquiry and to provide our submissions on the facts today. Thank you, Commissioner, Commission Council. It's been a pleasure participating in this inquiry alongside the parties and their representatives, and we look forward to our continued participation in the upcoming policy phase.
Thank you. I'm not sure, have we got the National Crowdfunding and FinTech Association or online? Not seeing them, not hearing them. Okay, so we'll go to the National Police Federation, please.
Thank you, Commissioner. My name is Nene Jones, and I am counsel to the National Police Federation. The National Police Federation is the union representing the regular members and the reservists of the RCMP. And so while we're obviously here because we're focused on the policing response in January and February 2022 in Coutts, in Emerson, in the Lower Mainland, in Windsor, and of course, primarily in Ottawa, we're also here because these are our members' working conditions. So these, when we talk about what's happening on the streets and what went right and what went wrong, it's our members who are living that reality on the ground. When we talk about boots on the ground, as we have many times, those are our members' boots. And so we also know that in the future, at similar protests, at similar occupations, our members are going to be the ones called upon to respond in similarly dangerous and uncertain working conditions. And so what the NPF wants for our members is to be deployed into these exigent circumstances with well-constructed, strong policing plan and in adequate numbers to perform their public order safety, or public order functions in a way that is safe for the protesters, for the community, and for our members. Now, the evidence here has been essentially undisputed that in the January and February protests led to a significant failure to maintain public order in our nation's capital. And there are a number of pieces of evidence that we will be reviewing in a great deal of detail in ours, or more detail anyway than I will today, in our submissions, and that you will be hearing about from all of my friends. But we know that there are a couple of key things from the NPF's perspective. First of all, Parliament is a frequent and regular target of political protest. We know also that the Freedom Convoy was a different kind of protest or occupation, and we heard evidence that it was a paradigm shift in terms of protesting and represents a change in what are likely to be future protest tactics. We also know that the surge capacity of police, that is the number of police officers who are available and able to be deployed quickly, is a crucial, perhaps more accurately, the crucial component of protecting a key site like Parliament Hill and the Ambassador Bridge, to use two key examples. The Ottawa police in Ottawa were effectively the only police of jurisdiction charged with the circumstances that arose in January and February 2022. And in Ottawa, one of the themes throughout this proceeding, throughout the evidence, has been that these federal democratic institutions, the ones right next door to where we are and further down the road, are in fact of extremely high value, symbolic value, as well as, of course, practical value and in the moment value. And that there are real questions about whether they should be outside or beyond the jurisdiction of the federal government, the federal government for policing purposes. In fact, it was a surprise to many of the witnesses, including some of the federal government witnesses that we heard from, the ministers. It was a surprise to many that it was so far outside of their reach. And we also know that there is an absence of a policing presence all along this strip on this side of Wellington, which may not show up very well in the transcript, but I'm sure we'll all remember where we're standing when we read it later. So as its status as the only police of jurisdiction, the OPS was left in a position to develop its response and develop its plan on its own. And you heard some evidence about in what I like to call the old days of a handful of years ago, in 2018 and 2015, when the RCMP policed this side of Wellington, that the RCMP would have been joint responding police of jurisdiction with the OPS. So we know that the OPS made the decision ultimately to allow the protesters to bring their vehicles onto Wellington and into the downtown core. And the NPF's view is that that was a terrible mistake. And the evidence in our submission shows that the RCMP, given their experiences with other large-scale events, would have made different planning decisions, including from the outset and including specifically on that point. Now, we recognize, of course, that our colleagues and our friends, members of the Ottawa Police Association who were on the ground, were doing their very best to maintain public order in extremely adverse conditions, particularly at the beginning when they were on their own. But the Ottawa Police Service was overwhelmed almost immediately, and there was friction, confusion, and delay in the ability of the Ottawa Police Service to obtain and deploy additional police resources. So much so that even here now, no one's exactly clear on how many police were eventually provided to Ottawa and at what, when, and at what stages, and frankly, in what roles. There was a lot of disagreement and finger pointing about that. And so in the NPF submission, we can draw a very sharp line from Ottawa to Emerson and to Coutts and to the Lower Mainland. And where we see that surge capacity being available to the responding police of jurisdiction, in all three of those cases, it was the RCMP who was the responding police of jurisdiction, but they were able to draw on those Article 9 resources that we heard evidence about to ensure that they could immediately and seamlessly provide that policing surge capacity on the ground in the moment it was required. And it was done in a way that provided for consistency of training, consistency of communication tools, and consistency of command structure. And so we heard evidence that the RCMP is uniquely positioned, given its size and its resources, given its cross-national status as Canada's National Police Service, to respond to these kind of public order emergencies. But the shortcomings in the legal and institutional framework through which policing was administered or is administered in Ontario, and particularly in the National Capital Region, pose significant barriers. And so we'll be advancing specific recommendations consistent with many of the recommendations that you're hearing today from my friends, including that the Police Services Act should be amended to extend full policing authority to the RCMP for purposes of municipal, provincial, or federal declared emergencies, that a statutory process should be developed to provide municipal police services in Ontario, and particularly the Ottawa Police Service, with the ability to request and obtain RCMP resources early, and that existing jurisdictional boundaries need to be re-examined and policing responsibility has to be supplemented, particularly again in the National Capital Region, so that the RCMP can provide the necessary support in situations of public order emergency. The Commission has been asked to make recommendations, and we hope that the NPF's recommendations which we, in our submission, are supported by the evidence, will be part of that. I do want to take one moment to thank you, Commissioner, very much, and also particularly to thank Commission Counsel, who have had at times a thankless role in this process. I suspect it has been almost exclusively thankless. They have been extraordinary colleagues and have done an amazing job. And I also want to thank all of my friends who have been counsel to the various parties. It has been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now the Canadian Constitution Foundation, unless you've traded again. Just checking.
It's okay. Sorry to disappoint you, Commissioner. It is me. Commissioner Rouleau, for the record, my name is Sujit Chaudhry, and I'm counsel for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. Commissioner, as you look over the evidence and prepare your report, we would suggest that you do so informed by history. In particular, we would invite you to look back at the cabinet minutes of the last use of emergency powers by cabinet before February 2022. The invocation of the War Measures Act in 1970 during the FLQ crisis. These minutes have been declassified and they are in the CCF's evidence. At the time, the Prime Minister did not initially recommend that the War Measures Act be triggered. The Security Committee of the Cabinet had met the previous day and were briefed by the security services that there was no apprehended insurrection in Quebec. The Honorable Jean Marchand, the political minister of Quebec, sharply disagreed at the cabinet meeting. He presented unverified intelligence at the cabinet table that the FLQ was, quote, a state within a state and heavily armed. He stated that failure to invoke the act was, quote, meant the risk of losing Quebec. In the end, the cabinet came around to Marchand's view. I have no doubt that Minister Marchand acted in good faith. However, it is now accepted that he and the cabinet were deeply mistaken. There was no apprehended insurrection in Quebec. The security services were right. Cabinet overreacted in the FLQ crisis. It should have relied on legal tools outside the War Measures Act. The basic mission of the Emergencies Act was to make sure that this kind of mistake never happened again. Under the War Measures Act, the Governor and Council had nearly unfettered discretion to determine if an apprehended insurrection existed. On first reading in Parliament, the Emergencies Act only required that the Governor and Council be, quote, of the opinion that a public order emergency exists. In committee, the act was amended to require that the Governor and Council believe on reasonable grounds that a public order emergency exists. Minister Perrin-Beatty, the author of the Emergencies Act, explained that the shift from an opinion to reasonable grounds test was to, quote, guarantee Canadians the ability that the courts could rule on whether the government had reasonable grounds to believe that a national emergency existed. The same holds true for this commission. Commissioner Rouleau, you must determine whether the Governor and Council had reasonable grounds to declare a public order emergency. We say that you must conclude that reasonable grounds did not exist for two reasons. First, the Governor and Council can only have reasonable grounds to determine a public order emergency exists if it is provided with all the relevant information to enable it to make a proper decision. The government has not established that the CSIS threat assessment was even provided to the full cabinet. There are good reasons to find in the record that it was not. In addition, the government has not established that the February 13th policing plan was provided to cabinet. Second, the proper interpretation of the Emergencies Act is that it incorporates the CSIS Act definition of a threat to national security. CSIS's own expert assessment of this event is that there was no threat to national security. In the face of this finding, the reasonable grounds test requires that the federal government provide evidence for why it disagreed with the CSIS assessment. It is simply not enough as a matter of law to say that the cabinet relied on a broader set of inputs to reach its decision. The invocation of the Emergencies Act has been and should remain exceedingly rare. But now that the glass has been broken on the Act, it can be used again. When the Commission asked hard questions about the Act's use in 2022, it must also focus on the Act's potential misuse in the future and protect the right to protest, parliamentary democracy, and federalism. We thank you, sir, and the Commission Council for your exceptionally hard work, and we look forward to continuing to work with you until this process is concluded. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association.
Commissioner. Kara Zwiebel on behalf of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. In February of this year, for the first time, the Government of Canada declared a public order emergency and put in place emergency measures that restricted the rights and freedoms of all people in Canada. These measures placed broad restrictions on the freedoms of Canadians to assemble and protest. They allowed for the government to compel the provision of services and for personal assets to be frozen with no notice and no due process. These orders handed law enforcement agencies and financial institutions extraordinary powers. The government may have intended these powers to be used in targeted ways, but as drafted, they gave law enforcement across the country measures whose application went well beyond the blockades and could easily have been abused. I have three submissions. First, the Emergencies Act does not allow for the suspension of charter rights, but without the existence of a public order emergency, the measures that were enacted would most certainly be contrary to the charter. In the absence of circumstances amounting to a national emergency, they would constitute serious restrictions on fundamental rights and freedoms that are neither reasonable nor justified in a free and democratic society. So the question, was there a national emergency that justified these measures, is a crucial one. The Canadian Civil Liberties Association respectfully submits that this question is important, not only for what it says about the events of January and February of this year, but also because of what it signals to future governments about when parliamentary process can be bypassed to allow the government to rule by executive order and when extraordinary powers can be used. Second, the Government of Canada has offered a range of justifications for its decision to invoke the Act. Its primary justification, articulated when the Act was first invoked, is set out in its Section 58 report to Parliament. Although that justification has evolved over time, its core elements are relatively simple and remain mostly intact. The justification focuses very heavily on economic disruption and harm. It also references concerns about the possibility of serious violence, either because of the presence of some violent extremists amongst otherwise non-violent protesters, the possibility that the protests would provide a cover for a lone wolf attack or allow threat actors to recruit, or the concern that violence would erupt in clashes with counter-protesters. Apart from the economic concerns, the evidence on which the government relies to back up these claims is extremely thin. The law enforcement and intelligence agencies, whose expertise should help inform the government's decisions, did not assess the protests as giving rise to a serious threat of violence. The most dangerous element we've heard about, the cell in Coutts, Alberta, with a cache of weapons, was investigated and arrested by law enforcement prior to the emergency orders coming into effect, without the use of any extraordinary powers, and without setting off a chain reaction of violence amongst protesters. The Emergencies Act was carefully crafted to avoid the excesses of the War Measures Act that preceded it. Parliament intentionally identified a public order emergency by tying it exclusively and exhaustively to the definition of threats to the security of Canada found in the CSIS Act. This definition does not include economic harm or disruption, nor should it. It requires activities directed toward or in support of the threat or use of acts of serious violence against persons or property for the purpose of achieving a political, religious, or ideological objective. The legal threshold to make use of the act was not met, and a creative and privileged legal opinion from the government that says otherwise doesn't make it so. The Prime Minister agreed that the threshold is no lower to invoke the act and restrict the rights of all Canadians than the standard set out in the CSIS Act to investigate and surveil a single individual. In our submission, the government exceeded the bounds of the law in taking the steps it did. Finally, there's no doubt that the blockades and protests gave rise to serious harms to the people living in communities where they occurred, that they caused significant economic disruption, and that law enforcement agencies were not well prepared to address them. The government, various governments, were struggling to get clear information from law enforcement about its plans and were wary of crossing the apparently still blurry line that risked undermining police operational independence. But the government also felt a great deal of pressure to do something to address the situation and to be seen to be doing something. Instead of establishing clear and appropriate lines of communication, having frank discussions, and putting instructions about strategic priorities to police in writing, the government gave law enforcement the biggest and most public nudge it could. It invoked the Emergencies Act and handed law enforcement across the country sweeping and unnecessary new tools and a clear political mandate to use them. One of the CCLA's core values is equality, and specifically the belief that the freedom of no one is safe unless the freedom of everyone is safe. We urge the Commission to bear this tenet in mind as it examines what the government did and considers what future governments may do. Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you to Commission Council and to my friends.
Okay, thank you. And now the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, Democracy Fund, and Citizens for Freedom.
Commissioner, my name is Alan Honor, and I'm counsel for the Democracy Fund, but I'm also addressing you on behalf of the JCCF and Citizens for Freedom. But we'd like to express our gratitude for this opportunity to participate in these proceedings. At the commencement of these public hearings, we stated that our goal was to get to the truth about why the government invoked the public order emergency. We wanted to hear evidence about whether the government met the legal threshold for invoking the Emergencies Act. Why the Emergencies Act was invoked is the primary and ultimate issue you should turn your mind to. I won't repeat the test for declaring a public order emergency because we've all heard it so many times. But I would like to address just one part of that test: threats to the security of Canada. In one way, this is a very high threshold for the government to meet, because threats to the security of Canada means more than ordinary threats or acts of violence. The definition requires serious violence or threats of serious violence for the purpose of achieving political, religious, or ideological objective. In our written submissions, we'll be looking at, among other things, the definition of. And Commissioner, we have heard we've heard evidence on many issues, but the reasons why the Emergencies Act was invoked is the primary and ultimate issue you should turn your mind to. I won't repeat the test for declaring a public order emergency because we've all heard it so many times. But I would like to address just one part of that test: threats to the security of Canada. In one way, this is a very high threshold for the government to meet, because threats to the security of Canada means more than ordinary threats or acts of violence. The definition requires serious violence or threats of serious violence for the purpose of achieving political, religious, or an ideological objective. In our written submissions, we'll be looking at, among other things, the definition of terrorist activity is set out in the Criminal Code and how it is similar to the CSIS definition. And in fact, some of the CSIS documents that were disclosed to the parties through this inquiry show that CSIS refers to Section 2C as terrorism and extreme violence. And this reference is indicative of just how high that threshold is. We submit, and the Prime Minister's evidence left little doubt, that this very high threshold is the same whether it applies in the Emergencies Act or the CSIS Act. The context, the decision maker, and the purpose are obviously different. There may even be different inputs, but those inputs are meant to answer the same question. Are there threats or acts of serious violence for political, religious, or ideological purposes? And that is the one and only standard. Commissioner, I've made reference to how high the threshold is, but in a different way, it's a low threshold. And on the issue of threats to security of Canada, it doesn't require, for example, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, nor does it even require proof on a balance of probabilities. The threshold only requires the Governor and Council to actually believe that there are threats to the security of Canada, and it requires that belief to be reasonable. And respectfully, we submit, and we will argue in detail, that the government has not even met this low threshold. There may be reasonable grounds to believe that some acts of violence were happening. Ripping off masks, police officers being swarmed, eggs being thrown, coffee being thrown. These and other things may have happened in the protest, which was of unprecedented proportions. And let me be clear, that is not acceptable. But those acts do not rise to the level of violence or threats which are required by the Act. And further, they do not reflect the attitudes, actions, and values of the vast majority of peaceful protesters. Even the most significant threat we heard of, which was the presence of weapons in Coutts, does not meet this threshold. And even if it did, it was neutralized. Those alleged criminals were sitting in an Alberta jail when the Emergencies Act was invoked. The threshold requires present threats, not past threats, not fear of the unknown. Canadians and even the international community are and will continue to be divided over the Freedom Convoy protests. Canadians will also be divided over future protests. As one of my friends aptly observed, tomorrow's protest could be about environmental issues, or it could be about some other political cause. To safeguard democracy, the rule of law, and the cherished right to protest for everyone, no matter what you believe, we must ensure that the Emergencies Act is only used as a last resort in the direst circumstances. Our detailed submissions will follow. We'd like to thank you again, Commissioner, Commissioner Council, and Commission Council, and the parties.
Okay, I've not missed anyone. Good, I've missed things before. I've not been perfect, and in fact, probably made more mistakes than most. But I want to say I found those final submissions to be very useful for me. Thank you for taking the time to think it through and give me some of the key issues, because again, I won't repeat it all the time, but I've got a little pressure to get at doing some writing. And it's nice to know what's going to be coming in, at least in general forms. And if you can get your submissions in early, they won't be turned back. I can assure you, we've extended the time at the request of some, but it is, I'm not going to shy away. It's very challenging to get this written because my hope is that once it is written and provided, there will be enough there that even if you don't agree with me, the facts will be there, the evidence, the analysis and fact-finding. But ultimately, these are very difficult issues. They overlap, and people could have different views and will have different views on these things. But I can assure you I'll do the very best I can. Now, this brings the fact hearings of the Commission to an end. It was, believe it or not, 43 days ago I first convened these hearings. Since then, we've heard from 75 witnesses, filed numerous overview reports, witness statements, witness interviews, and have introduced over 7,000 documents into evidence. You're a bunch of lawyers. I've rarely seen something that happened in February that has reached this point after less than 10 months. It is an amazing feat. Time has flown by. I'm sure you're the same. At least I hope some of you agree that it wasn't boring. We've managed, albeit with long days and some very late evenings, to stay on schedule. And we've met what you've probably heard me say too many times, our unique timetable. And for that, I'm most grateful. Most importantly, I'm satisfied that I now have the evidence that I need to make the factual findings and to answer the questions I've been mandated to ask. Namely, why did the federal government declare the emergency? How did it use its powers? And were those actions appropriate? These are questions that, as I said at the outset, the public wants answered. And I'm confident that I am now well positioned to provide those answers. I'm also equipped to report on the additional issues as mandated by our order in council. The evolution of the goals of the convoy movement and broader protests and their leadership, organization, and participants. The impact of domestic and foreign funding, including crowdsourcing platforms. The impact, role, and sources of misinformation and disinformation, including social media. The economic and other impacts of the blockade and the efforts of police and other responders prior to and after the declaration, always to the extent that these issues are relevant to the circumstances of the declaration and the measures taken. It
was important for me to hear the points of view of those who took part in the events or who were affected by those events. I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to hear those points of view, and I'm waiting for the written observations of the parties now that will help me in concluding the work of the Commission. I'm happy that we could lead those hearings in an open and transparent way, not only for the parties and the councils and the media, but also for the numerous Canadians who took this opportunity to see the hearings either in person or through our direct broadcasting.
Pleased by the fact that these hearings have, by and large, taken place without a hitch. Commission counsel and all counsel showed flexibility, innovation, and creativity. This didn't just happen. I asked for everyone to work cooperatively to ensure that the facts and information necessary for the public to understand what happened and why it happened would be elicited. And my expectations were met. Council, you all rose to the occasion generally, and there's a bit of grumbling, but generally without a hint of grumbling. I understand most of it occurred when I wasn't there. Now, of course, there were issues, but we were able to resolve them in an appropriate manner. Or again, some people don't agree with how I resolve things, but that's neither the first time that's happened to me. You'll be pleased to know. Time limits were almost always observed, subject, of course, to the regular, may I just have one more question? And that was perfectly fine. Indeed, it was appropriate to ensure that the necessary questions be asked and answered. And you probably have seen I was quite flexible with timelines within the bounds of reasonableness. So I want to thank Council and the parties for their contribution to the success of these hearings. And by success, I mean getting to have a record that can be used. I should note that there's no question that the Commission's timeframe did present challenges. There were a staggering number of documents produced by the parties in response to the Commission's requests, including by the federal government. The productions have been of critical importance to the Commission's mandate and have resulted in a level of transparency that is, if not unprecedented, I'd say it's virtually unprecedented. But the needs of the Commission to review these documents and the right of the parties to redact on various legal grounds necessarily created time constraints and challenges for all concerned. Where appropriate, the Commission challenged certain redactions, and there have been instances where the government, at the Commission's request, removed redactions. We understand there were challenges, but at the end of the day, I think the record is, as I have said, fulsome to allow for me to make the necessary findings. Par conséquent, la divulgation de documents.
Consequently, the divulgation of documents continued throughout the hearings. The councils worked constantly to make sure that documents would be put at the disposal of the parties as soon as possible. I recognize that parties had to deal with documents on short notice, and as much as possible, I accommodated the parties, allowing them to add documents to their list of documents for review, and by granting them additional time for their cross-examination. And I was able to do so while respecting our timetable. And that process helped me appreciating the relevant facts and to improve my understanding of the relevant issues. The question raised by the parties also helped me, and this was very important for me.
The process and questioning by parties has been very much of assistance to me, and I want to thank Council for that. Et maintenant, si vous le permettez,
and now, if you allow me, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to people who worked in the hearing room and to make sure that the hearings would take place. This commission was created and the process was executed by a talented group of colleagues, and that made the task a lot easier for me.
In fact, I've sometimes think I'm no more than a puppet with a lot of puppeteers behind who are making the whole system work. And I deserve virtually no credit for all that's happened to date. It's an unbelievable team that I have had supporting me. Notre directrice exécutive,
our executive director, Hélène Laurando, our office manager, Véronique Perrault, and her staff.
They put together this whole operation, which I think you will agree with me has been very well done in a very short period. l'équipe de gestion d'événements et de conférences.
The event management team and the technical team with Yvon Lamoureux that took care of the broadcasting of the hearings.
Technology has been amazing to allow this to happen. My co-lead counsel, who I owe so much to, as you know, Shantona Chowdhury, and she says Chaudhry, and I always make it wrong, but I'll learn. I'm a slow man to learn, but I blame it on my French, but that's not true. And Jeff Leon. My senior team of lawyers, Aaron Dan, who created really the basis for these hearings, who's not here with us today, but is back in Toronto. Frank Au, Gord Cameron, Natalia Rodriguez, Dan Shepard, and Gabrielle Poliquin, who I'm happy to report is quite well, and will be involved next week. My regional lawyers, Mana Duckett, Sasha Paul, and Maya Turumi, who you have not seen here, but who were important in collecting the information which has made it into the record from the various border blockades out west. And the two you probably know best, Eric Brousseau and John Mather, my God, have they been good. They have put out more fires than the fire department. And they also had other duties you might not believe. They were doing this part-time, running this hearing. But I'm greatly indebted to them. And then the team of lawyers, some of which you've seen, I guess most of them, or if not all of them you've seen, Stephen Armstrong, Misha Boutier, Sajeda Hedarali, Alexandra Hine, Nusra Khan, Etienne Lacombe, Alison McMahon, Jean-Simon Schoenholtz, Dalia Shuhaibar, and Guillaume Sirois-Gingras. And yeah, they're at the beginning of their career by and large, but boy, are they competent and hardworking once again, I must say. Couldn't have done it without them, and I'm also going to lean on them to help me in the next phase a bit, but I'm sure they'll be happy to help. I'd also like to recognize our policy advisors, Mark Fryman, Mark Pritchard, and Mark Sandler, our communications advisors, Michael Tanzi and Marie-Claude Gagné, our public input team under Patrick Pilon, Madame Registrar, Stacy Huber, Ms. Lynn Mahoney, and our document clerks from Juristica, who amazed me with their ability. And it's to make documents seemingly appear from nowhere, but also the challenge. You don't know the half of the problems getting all the federal documents from their system to our system to what, I won't go there. Our translators, transcriptionists, and interpreters, they have been incredible, and some of you made their life very difficult. You know who you are. Our research council, who guided and continue to guide the policy aspects of the commission and planned the roundtables for the policy hearings next week. Geneviève Cartier, chair of the council, Jamie Cameron, Michel Galland, Nomi Claire Lazare, Kent Roach, Clifford Shearing, and Jocelyn Stacy. And finally, our security team and the staff of Public Service and Procurement Canada and Library and Archives Canada. They've all worked to make, again, this whole hearing go well, making us feel safe, made us feel welcome and comfortable. I think that that team, those three teams are important to have to this, bringing this together. Now, before closing, I want to address the people of Canada in two respects. I was delighted that approximately 9,500 Canadians took the time to make a submission through our public input process. These submissions were most helpful to me and our council team to understand your observations, experiences, and ideas. They contributed to making this a truly public inquiry. It was important for the Commission to hear from the public and understand the views of Canadians. I now have that understanding to provide an important backdrop for the Commission's mandate. It's fair to say, if you've gone through that document, that this is a very divisive issue at the root of this whole convoy and what has come out of it. And I think this process, I hope, will be of assistance to people to understand and move forward. It is a truly humbling to me to be involved in this. I can assure you it's I would almost say overwhelming to see the interest, the concerted response from people. I wasn't looking for fame and fortune, but I think I'm kind of stuck now to be at least a figure at some neighborhoods. Je remercie aussi le peuple canadien de l'intérêt.
I also thank all Canadians for their interest in the Commission's work, and thank you for the confidence that you put in me to undertake this significant inquiry. It is a privilege and an honor to serve as a commissioner. We have a lot of work to do to prepare and finalize our report. I assure you that we will keep doing all that is possible to bring you the answers to the questions that were raised by the mandate. You deserve nothing less than that.
All that is possible to bring forward the answers to the questions raised by our mandate. And as I said at the outset, they deserve nothing less. So thank you and good evening. I now declare these the fact hearing portion closed. I may not see a lot of you now that we move to the next phase, given that the submissions will be in writing, but I do feel I've made some friends, maybe some enemies too, but I like to think I've made some friends because virtually all of you I did not know. And it has been a very, very pleasant experience. And thank you all for tolerating me. And my I guess, difficult task is always is still in front of me. Thank you very much.
Standing ovation. Shout out to Polycoin. We hardly knew you, brother, before you passed suddenly. Shout out to Frank Al. Shout out to you, brother. Shout out to all. Shout out to all the eggheads. All the eggheads. Big
full
shout
dozen
out.
At least.
This guy with his shout outs. Shout out to
passionate. He's really passionate.
Shout out.
Standing ovation, everybody.
Standing.
You know who he didn't shout out? He didn't shout out the real heroes like Chris Deering, Maggie Hope Braun. You know, I want to give those people shout outs.
That's too real, man. That's too real. Holy crap, man. I was just shouting out all the eggs, you know what I mean? Rolly the Rockstar. He's like, I know now. He's like, I know now when I walk down different neighborhoods, people can recognize me. I'm Rolly. You know, I'm just
what's this? He's like, I'm a star now, guys. I'm a star. Oh, my, Rolly. Get over yourself.
Shout out to the Wire Brush. Says during Lighthouse. Oh, he's gonna cry. Did that man survive? Don't worry about that, CJ. He's tweeting.
There are way more important things.
Man, I want to shout out. Realistically, I want to shout out to the chat. We could not have done this without you. You're the lifeblood of the internet because you are the people. We are the people, all of us together, doing this, and you've enabled us to actually, man, to do this, to go through those 40 plus days. Incredible, really incredible. Best chat, says BST. Absolutely. Rolly the Rockstar. Shout out to Miller. Shout out to the chat. Hail, says my sister Ange. Hail, Rowan Pan. Hail, the chat. Thank you, Corporal Dag. We got Bad Egg Productions. Hail, War Campaign. Hail, brother. This is it. Shout out to Weed, says Rowdy Roddy. He needed the weed to get through those days. Mm-hmm. Got a lot of hearts for Rolly from Anonymous. Bomber Hail, a lot of hearts. Hearts and thumbs up. Hail from Sweden. Wow, Sweden watching. You see that?
Beautiful.
Amazing. Yeah, really. I'm telling you. Monday, we're going to come back, do a live recap, get some rest. It's been a long 40 days, and we're going to do 2 hours. Maybe right before noon Eastern time, somewhere around 11 or something like that. We'll go live. What do you think, Pan? 11 Eastern? Should we do that?
Yeah, man. That's a plan, brother.
All right.
That is a plan.
There you go. 2 hours. We'll do 11 Eastern, and we'll do like a recap. We'll see what the media's been saying, and we'll just relax and just have a laugh in the chat. You know what I mean? So there you go. That'll be on Monday, 11 a.m. I'll set a video up there, and just relax for a little bit, man. And I'm going to sleep in on Monday morning. Haven't slept in. I'm going to play with my dog.
Oh, man.
Right?
That's going to feel so good. You get a little more sleep, you know?
A little bit more sleep. There you go. 11 is great. I'll be making breakfast 11 Eastern. There you go. Hail, Sweden. Hail. The chat says BC Joe. It has been incredible. We've seen so many people, so many personalities. The government has hired absolutely the most, the biggest characters that I've ever seen in my life. And I got a lot of hope, not because of a lot of the jokers here, right? There's been quite a couple of good people here, a couple of interesting arguments made, especially in closing. Like what Sujit put together there, talking specifically about the amendments to the Emergency Act. That's something to think about right there. If that's a takeaway in terms of actual logic and sense, even though like we're kind of losing it with the Prens. But Sujit, he mentioned the fact that there were amendments made to the Emergency Act that actually limited the scope. Okay. You really had to have that, what is equivalent to a clear and present danger, something like that. Anyways, you can go through that and watch it again, but that was him bringing it together. That's what this was about. The Emergency Act kind of became a trial of the convoy itself. But you know what? I know now that we're all together. We're doing amazing. We're going to continue, and we're going to stay united right here. There you go. My voice is going. We need to hold these guys accountable, says BST. Scroll down, says Jeremy V. See, they scroll down. Best party I ever been to work with. There you go. Best party. What do you think, Pan?
Yeah, no, it's been amazing. You know, thank you everybody for being here with us. Pran, scro. We got some new terminology to have fun with, to banter around in the chat. And the community of the chat, it's where it's at. Like Rose said, you guys are the lifeblood of YouTube. You guys are the lifeblood of War Campaign. The exchange of information and ideas, that's how we're going to win. So that's what we're going to do.
Absolutely. Check out the Telegram room. The link is in the description. If you want to, throw in some links or whatever else, you find something interesting, you want other people to see it who are here, that's the way you can do that in between these streams. Throw that into that room right there. Let's see here. We got Mr. Hammerdance says, shout out to Deep Undercover. Thank you for the commentary, Rowan Pan, these past 31 days. Hail. Thank you, Dean. Thank you. And thank you to all the chat. There's so many beautiful messages. I've been reading them. I can't respond to them all, but I've been reading them. They're amazing. Really, truly, truly. Malcontents. That's right. Malcontents, Yahoos. Right?
That's right. That's right. There were some other ones too. I can't recall now.
Yeah.
Swarm. We're Swarm.
That too. There's one. Yeah, you remember and tell us, and we're going to remember this. This has been a historical event. Just remember now, I want everybody to rest up, okay? I know we've all been like nuts. Everybody's been glued to this. And get that balance into your life. And then come back and join us on Monday, refreshed, rejuvenated, and resplendent. And we will see you then. Hail, brethren, honor, accountability, integrity, and loyalty. Let's bring those virtues back. Let's live those virtues, and let's make our countries, all of our countries, our Western nations, our beacons of light and hope to the world. Let's make them worth living again. Hail, brethren, and thank you so much. Thank you.
The Emergencies Act Commission wrapped up this week with appearances from high-ranking government officials. Janice Charette, the clerk of the Privy Council and the head of the Public Service, and Nathalie Drouin, the deputy clerk. They both testified on the number of meetings between cabinet, senior officials, and the Prime Minister that ultimately led to the government invoking the Emergencies Act for the first time in that legislation's history.
There was some importance to try and get this moving once it looked like that's the direction things were going to be moving in. We wanted to be able to move quickly. And the Prime Minister, he will tell you his own story about this. He was eager to make the decision and to move forward.
Okay, as Ms. Charette said, the Commission will hear from the Prime Minister next week. We're all looking forward to that testimony. But first, we're going to go to the CBC's Karina Roman, has been following the testimony today. And Karina, these are some of the, these are the top-ranking officials in the Canadian government. What sort of insight did they give on how the Prime Minister came to the decision to invoke